In this devlog, we're talking about Metroidvania abilities. Welcome to Devlog 4 of Cloverskar. If this game seems like something you might like, consider supporting the development by adding the game to your wishlist on Steam. The link will be in the description. Ability gating is one of the core concepts that defines the Metroidvania genre. Usually, video games are either divided into levels or the game world is open for the player to explore. Metroidvanias fall somewhere in between. The world technically is open, but here and there you might run into a gap that's a little bit too big to cross. There's no physical object blocking your way, but it seems like you might need something like a dash or a double jump in order to be able to jump far enough. This is ability gating. Even though these two parts of the world are connected, the gap acts like a kind of a lock, and the player ability is the key that unlocks the next level. So, while making the player abilities for my game, I tried to design some level snippets which are going to be blueprints for these soft locks between levels. For example, the player in my game can normally jump 5 blocks without any upgrades. Although this is a very difficult jump, and the player would need to take advantage of coyote time in order to make it across. So I basically never use 5 block gaps in my game. Really quickly, for those of you who don't know, coyote time is a feature most platformer games have where the player is able to jump while in the air for a couple of frames after walking off a ledge. Games usually have this feature to make the platforming sections feel more fair and forgivable, and even though this is a great thing to have in your game, you should never require players to use coyote time in order to get across a platforming section. A good game design rule to follow is to make every gap in your game either obviously jumpable or obviously impossible, so that the player intuitively knows if this is where they're supposed to go or not. This is why I never use 5 block gaps, since they're just barely jumpable and I don't want players to get stuck retrying a basic jump over and over again. As I mentioned in my previous devlogs, I've already added the glide ability to my game. While the player is in the air, pressing and holding the jump button will activate this ability and lower the maximum fall speed, resulting in this slow descent. This ability is obtained after defeating the first boss of the game. For the visuals, I made these clovers swirling around the player while the ability is active. As an example for a level section where the player would need to use the glide ability in order to cross into a new area, I have this gap where the two ledges are 6 blocks apart, and the ledge across the gap is 1 block lower than the one the player would be standing on. This should hint to the player that the glide ability needs to be utilized in order to get to the other side. The dash ability is pretty much a staple in Metroidvanias. It's relatively easy to implement, but it makes the movement much more fun, so I thought why not try it out and see if I can make it feel good to use. The code is very simple and easy to understand for anybody who's played around with Unity's rigid bodies. What I do is I disable the player's gravity and I add some instant velocity in the direction of the dash, and I invoke a coroutine which stops the dash after 0.25 seconds and resets the gravity. I played around with the length of the dash, and 0.25 seconds seems to be a nice balance between too long and too short. In the future I might add an upgrade which extends the length of the dash, but that's a topic for another day. Visually, I decided to use the same green color of the glide ability, and I decided to make all the abilities use the same green so that this color consistently represents player abilities. So, when dashing, the player turns completely green and leaves a trail of silhouettes and particles behind. Next, I really wanted to make an ability which utilizes the bow and arrow. My idea for this upgrade was to act like a kind of grappling hook. So the first thing I did was I added these green circles, which are going to be the objects to which the player can attach. Then I made it so that when the player shoots at these objects, this rope appears, attaching the player to the green circle. So all that I needed to do now was to make the player lunge towards the green circle, which works in pretty much the same way as the dash ability, but unlike the dash, which can only work horizontally, this ability can lunge the player in any direction. All I need to do is to take the position of the green circle and subtract the player's position from it. This gives me a vector which represents the direction from the player towards the circle. I can then call this lunge method with the vector I just calculated, and the player is going to be pulled towards the attached object. Next, I'm going to animate the rope as the player is being pulled, and finally I'm going to turn it off as soon as the player begins falling. Wall jump is another player ability which is very common among Metroidvania games. One of the reasons I think this is because it opens the traversal of the world in a more vertical way. This is also why I think double jump has become one of the essential abilities in most platformer games. Platformers are by design very horizontal, which can limit the level design, making the game feel like a series of hallways going left to right. Abilities like double jump and wall jump allow the player to defy the law of gravity, a law which most platformers revolve around. This opens up the level design possibilities and overall makes the game more fun. The way I implemented wall jump in my game is by creating these two colliders on the player object, and while the player is falling, if any of these two colliders are touching a wall, the player sticks to the wall and enters the wall jump mode. From here, the player has the ability to jump, lunging themselves in the direction opposite the wall they're holding onto. It's very simple and works much like a wall jump in any other game. So in total, this brings the number of player abilities to 4, which I think should be enough for now. I am planning to release a demo of this game this year, so I think these 4 abilities should be enough for a demo. I definitely have many ideas for other player abilities which I want to implement, but I want to hold off on those until I finish the first playable build of the game. In the meantime, I'm currently working on adding some new levels to the game, new enemies, NPCs, etc. The level I'm currently working on is going to be kind of like a central level, something like the Forgotten Crossroads in Hollow Knight. All the other levels I build in the future are going to connect to this one in some way, so it's very important that the traversal feels good and that there are many different ways of traversing the level based on the abilities the player has unlocked. So stay tuned for future devlogs. If you don't want to miss any future updates, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you have enjoyed this video. Also, the best way to support the development of this game is to add Cloverskar to your wishlist on Steam.